Yeah, so this paper is joined with Arnaud Costinot who's at MIT as well. And I always like to tell a little small story how one starts a paper. And this paper started thinking about these topics, robots and trade. And we really were a little bit upset at the way people were discussing these topics. And maybe, we had a view that, for instance, people were starting to think about maybe there should be some protection or some regulation of technology and things like that. And we were thinking this is so wrong-headed. And honestly, I think this is the nice thing about research. Sometimes you go into a project and you change your mind a little bit. And this is going to be an example of that. So I'll try and highlight what I mean by that. But the main motivation of this paper is something that's well known, that technological progress comes with great improvements in efficiency, but may have at a cost inequality. And I don't think economists have completely ignored that, but more recently, I think the kind of evidence people are putting forward and the concerns with very big, drastic changes in technology and the way production takes place have brought those things to the forefront. And for instance, in the case of robots, the kind of evidence that I'm talking about has been still very early empirical literature, but some evidence by Acemoglu and Restrepo I'm going to talk about. In the case of rise of China, this famous paper by Otter et al. I'm just kidding, Otter, Dorn, and so on. And we really see trade as similar to technology in that, we think of it as a way in which a country is effectively transforming goods. And just like in the case of technology, that comes with a gain in efficiency, but may have effects on distribution. Okay? So you'll see that one of the spirits of this paper is to put those two kind of seemingly different topics in the same framework. And I guess these trends have been going on for a long time, and people used to talk about technologically biased advancement and so on, but now robots may be something people are more concerned about, or artificial intelligence. And the same thing with trade. There's been an increase in trade for a very long time, but especially now the rise of China may be something that has brought this more to the forefront. And clearly, I think politically it's on the agenda more. There's been a disinhibition of thinking about these issues, okay? Thinking about potentially protection because of the distributional effects, and perhaps less discussed, but I think in the background in some of the discussions about technology, okay? So all this is happening and people are discussing this, but I think that we really need to sort of sharpen the questions and sharpen the way we approach these questions. So what we're going to do in this paper is try and answer these questions. I hope you find them interesting. The first is, if technological progress comes along, when should we welcome this technological progress, and when should we stand to benefit from it overall as a country? And instead, when may we be hurt by this technological progress because of the distributional effects? Okay, that's the first question I want to ask. The second is, and inherent in this first question is already what policy. There's some policy tools I want the government to be handling. Okay, and so relatedly, in the background, I want to also ask exactly what kind of policy should we have with respect to these two things. All right. So completely disinhibited, okay, should we have protection from trade for the distributional concerns? In the case of robots, should we tax robots? Okay, and maybe more subtly, maybe if we don't tax them, but maybe we shouldn't be subsidizing research in artificial intelligence and robotics as we currently do. The government funds research in those areas. It's implicitly a subsidy. So we could even ask the question of, should we be in the business of taxing instead that kind of innovation, disincentivizing it instead of incentivizing it? So these are the two questions we want to address today. And I really see this, the purpose of this paper, and very much in the spirit of the conference today, which I saw some excellent work, is going to be a paper that's trying to create a bridge between the theory and the empirical work. Okay, so the way I'm going to answer these questions is to try and create a framework, an economic framework, to clarify what features of the data will speak to these questions. All right, and tentatively use them to get answers. But I think the main contribution is to provide a framework. You can go and provide a different answer with different evidence, perhaps. But I want sort of a general framework for thinking about these questions, all under the same umbrella, with very basic economic principles, and bringing in the current empirics. The current empirics I have in mind are these, just to flash them up very quickly. I'm going to get back to this. There's now evidence using quantile regressions of the effects of trade and technology in the form of robots on the wage distribution. And that's the kind of evidence we want to tap into. Okay, so we're bridging to these purely reduced form empirical work and trying to get to this. Okay, so as an economist, this is maybe where we were coming from when we were debating these questions with Arnaud. We would hear the interesting work by Otter, Dorn Hansen, etc. And this, in the same breath, people would discuss how economists always, abstracted from distributional issues, and they just thought about the first best. And that's true maybe of some economists, not true of myself since I graduated, and not true of Floria and many other economists here in this conference. We usually think of a second best. Instead, so in the first best world, it's true that we would not be concerned with distributional issues. Okay, the welfare theorems of economics tell us that we should have free trade, and we should have technology adoption that's undistorted. It's not distorted. But there are important results, even with distortions, in the face of limits to our potential for distribution, that imply that we don't necessarily want to distort trade, and we don't necessarily want to distort technology adoption. And here we had in mind the second best results of an important seminal paper of Diamond and Merlis, which they only allowed proportional linear taxes, and yet they found that you want to have production efficiency, and you do not want to create distortions between two firms. And a tax on robots would be exactly that, a distortion between two firms. And likewise, they pointed out as a corollary, you would not want to impose import tariffs, okay? Because that would be also a distortion between different producers. So that was a benchmark we had in mind when we started this, and almost we were, should we just write a note reminding about these results? And then we realized that that's how subtle sometimes applying economic theory is. You have to think hard about what was in that model, and we realized we didn't think that it was necessarily apply always. And the main thing is, although taxes are limited, they're still quite rich to get to this result. So in particular, if you want to help a certain group like the coal miners in Pennsylvania, okay, then the assumption here was you had a subsidy on the wages of coal miners in Pennsylvania. And that doesn't seem to be, for whatever reason, the kind of policies that we typically think are most notably on the table, okay? So instead, we want to think of more realistic, more restricted set of taxes so that we do have an income tax to redistribute, but it's anonymous. It's not going to depend on characteristics like what industry you're in and so on, okay? And once you're in that world, where there were some previous results of this sort, qualitative results like Naito, that in general you will want to worry about what wages are and try to influence them indirectly, okay? So in general, that's going to imply you will want to tinker with barriers to trade or taxes on robots, okay? All right, so what we're going to do here is instead provide a very general framework for thinking about this kind of third best, if you want to call it that. And like I said, try to develop the theory so that it delivers a bridge to the empirical work. That's going to come in the form of sufficient statistics, okay? So we're going to be able to tell you what empirical moments we want to look at and how to use them to get at these questions I set up at the beginning. So just to give you the answers and then try and justify them, when is technological change welcome? What we find is with the instruments that we consider, it's always welcome. In other words, it's just as welcome as in the first best world. So for this question, given that the tax instruments we have, you still are always better off if technology for robotics improves. Okay, I'll try and explain where that's coming from. But an important implication of that is you do not want to hold back innovation. You wouldn't want to work on that margin, okay? Because you always welcome any innovation, you wouldn't want to restrict innovation, for example. And a related point is you would always be better off if the terms of trade improve and go in your favor. So if your imports go down in price, you're always better off, okay? That's related. That's like an improvement in the technology of trade, okay? So, for example, if trade costs fall or if China opens up more to trade, you will always be better off, according to this result. Okay, I'll try and explain that result. It's not obvious. It wasn't obvious to us. It's going to be the simplest result of the paper, though, and it'll be obvious once we understand it. But, given that there was a trade-off, it wasn't obvious to us that would happen. And then, perhaps here's the main results. How should government policy respond to, or how should it be implemented in the face of this trade-off? And here, I said the main result is going to be a formula with sufficient statistics that bridges to the empirical work. Those sufficient statistics, the formula is going to look like the tax, for instance, on trade, the tariffs should be, I'll give you a formula. In particular, in that formula, there's going to be elasticities in shares that we can hopefully measure from the data, okay? And I'll show you based on these kind of early estimates how one should use them, okay? In particular, the key sufficient statistic that we found very interesting is that we just need to know what's going to happen with the wage distribution, okay? And that kind of quantile regression I was talking about, okay? So we don't have to figure out the intricacies of how production takes place, and even though those intricacies might be interesting for other things, so for instance, do we need to write down, for those familiar, a certain production function or another, or a task-based model or not? If conditioning on these kind of reduced forms, you do not need to do that. And we found that kind of interesting. All right. And then we have at the end of a small result that's more forward-looking and speculative, but basically a comparative static result that if technology continues to improve, we want to talk about not just where taxes should be now, but where should they be in the future. And we have there a little bit of an example that shows that even though, let's say robots, to take the case of robots, at present they're available, but they'll be even cheaper or more productive in the future. As that happens, the tax might not go up, as you might think intuitively, on robots, but might go down, okay? Right? So even though we're more worried about the future, the actual response might go in the opposite direction. I'll try and explain why. Okay? But that's a little bit of an example just to countervail what most people might think, right? But the key result of the paper is this formula, which you can always apply. Yes?
To which extent do these formulas depend on the optimality of the labor income tax that you discussed?
No, they won't depend. I'll try and explain why. The main one we're interested in it will not. Okay? That's a good question. I don't even know what optimality really means. I'm going to set it up in such a way that as related to your paper, I can think I can think of almost a political process as well. Okay. So just to say, of course, we know from the world and all these countries are talking about trade taxes, robot taxes. Does that sound weird? Well, like Bill Gates has even offered his advice that we should tax robots, okay? And he gives us an example. There's a way to make it sound plausible. It sounds unfair. The robot works, and what if it looked just like a human? I look like a robot now with this microphone. And it's almost like, well, the robot's not paying taxes and the human has to pay taxes. So it's almost equalizing. That's his argument. It would be equalizing the playing field to tax robots. So it sounds very intuitive when said that way. Okay, so, and in fact, he proposes a 50% tax. So it's kind of to get close to how much we tax humans. Okay, and so that's kind of, it's not, and I think maybe in the future we really have to seriously consider that. So that's just to say it's maybe not as present in the policy debate today, but I do think it's something that we're going to increasingly have to have an answer for. Okay, so related literature, just to mention briefly, I discussed already this seminal work by Diamond Murley, Dixit Norman, Naito, etc. There's some interesting related work to Naito on trade in particular, asking whether we always want to open to trade. And then there's a literature inspired by political economy that are also connected to distributional issues and protection. Okay, and then this question, our first question on whether we welcome trade or not, is connected to this kind of welfare impact of technological change by Solow, Holton, and these recent papers by Baki and Farhi. And on the optimal tax on robots, there's some other work out there, interesting work, in particular Guerrero, Rebelo, Teles, and Thumo, that is related to our application to robots. In particular, they also note, as in Naito, that you would in general want to have a tax on robots that's not zero. Our work is different from this kind of work, mainly from all this kind of work, in that we are trying to go the route, which is popular in public finance, of deriving a set of sufficient statistics and a formula that doesn't depend on too many details of the structural model. Okay, so instead of writing a particular CES model, for example, of production and deriving the optimal tax in that framework, having something more general, okay, that then we can skip directly to the reduced form evidence. Okay, yeah.
Can you maybe briefly define what a robot is for your world, like AI? Is this a robot?
Yes, that's a good question. Robots, here's a catch-all for all these technological advances and implement that firms would have to pay for to use, that we're worried about will affect the demand for labor and wages. So to be honest, I'm using robots, but maybe I should include artificial intelligence and other machine learning. All the applications of that would fall under this framework. And in fact, some people comment, well, what about just normal capital? And that also falls under this framework. And there is some evidence that, regular 1980s capital was also affecting relative wages. Okay, I think it's just that then this robot seems like it could have a bigger effect, and so it's our prime example. But conceptually, it's the same as any other input. Okay, yeah.
Comments very seriously. We also think of hyper-qualified workers, also like a gradient. So if you want to think of them as robots in the sense that they increase the productivity of all workers, or something.
I'm not sure I understand that. So say that. Can you ask that again?
So let's say we take the highest productive,
Yeah.
the most productive workers in the spectrum.
Yeah.
Just set them apart. We say, look, they went to Harvard and MIT, so let's call them the closest we get to robots.
Yeah.
So, and
Thank you.
they cannot manipulate their affiliation. So
Yeah.
and then we say, would you conclude something similar?
No.
Test them.
I think no, because of the following. So yes, in general, your argument. I'll come to that in later, but actually, most people would think the reverse, that the high-skilled, let's say having more high-skilled workers would actually contribute to improving the wages of the low-skilled and lowering the wages of the high-skilled, right? The regular sort of law of demand, okay? So it would go the opposite direction of robots. So in fact, a lot of the fear of robots is that it's replacing the more mechanical tasks, so not the most high-skilled tasks that still require creativity or require non-routine tasks, okay? But in the general spirit, yes, you could treat that question similarly. I just think it might have the opposite sign. One application we're thinking of this framework, but this kind of gets ahead. I had this for the conclusion, but I'll say it now because you asked, to think about immigration. So immigration is a question where, okay, should we let workers in, and what skill sets should we, if we're going to only allow limited workers, which ones? And there you have to think of these complementarities and what's the impact on the wage distribution. I think our framework provides a way to think about that question clearly. So that's kind of related. Okay, so the roadmap. Please keep asking questions. This is really will help with the presentation, I think. And I'm very happy to get questions. So subsidized questions. The general framework, I'm going to present that. That's a little bit abstract. I hope you don't get too lost, but even if you do, I hope you grasp the general idea there. That's much more important than the details of the notation and such. And then I'm going to try and answer these two questions, okay, and then I'm going to provide this application using the available evidence, okay? So let's jump into that general framework. So the model is inspired by sort of a Merle's model. So at the core, we want some heterogeneity across agents that leads them to earn different amounts so that there's inequality in earnings. We're going to have that's going to be parameterized by theta. So there's a population of agents, a continuum, ideally like a unit mass of workers that are going to be supplying labor. And they're distinguished by some characteristic theta. And in the Merle's model, that's one-dimensional, and it's just the higher theta types are more productive, okay, than the lower theta types. And in equilibrium, they earn more. We're going to allow something more general. This is for a subset of you that are into public finance. This is probably one of the places we're kind of proud technically. We were able to work with a general distribution in the sense of allowing multidimensional theta. So theta could be a vector of two numbers, for example, and that would be like the Roy model. Okay, so maybe it's one element of theta is how good you are as a software programmer, and another is how good you are as a construction worker. Okay, and so it's not parameterized by one number only. Okay, but then so I'm going to try to fit the whole model on one slide. Okay, I think I can do it. It's going to get the font smaller and smaller. No, I'm just kidding. Then these workers are consumers, and workers, they have this utility function, which is quite general. So they just have some utility over labor, which is N, and consumption. A word about labor. When I think about these models, I don't want to think of it too narrowly as hours. These are a model. This is going to be some catch-all for effort in life. Okay, how much effort you put in life. Okay, because this is for the most part, we're going to work here with a static model. So I should think of this as kind of how much effort you make against your leisure in general to earn more. Okay, and I think of hours as only one component. Maybe it's taking jobs you like less, but allow you to produce more. Maybe it's training early in your career and so on. Okay. And then capital C here is the utility you get from consuming goods, and that's just there's a sub-utility. You actually consume many different goods, okay, and you have a sub-utility function. So the only preference restriction here that we adopt for simplicity really is weak separability, okay. So no particular good is complementary with putting in effort, okay. We could extend that, we'd get the usual thing. So we just wanted to focus on what's new and kept it cleaner this way. Okay. So the curly bracket means there's many goods I. Okay. It's a vector. So this is kind of important if we want to think about trade. Maybe there's the American good, the Chinese good, so on. Yes.
Weak separability between C and N, or between the different CI?
No, there's no restriction on this V.
Okay.
The restriction is embedded in these two equations that the different C's, one is not more complement with N than any other. It's already captured by its notation. So no further note than in this note. I'm just translating this note, what's here. And then on the technological side, we want to have something very general. And this is what we have. It's basically the kind of thing you see in general equilibrium theory. So we're grabbing the most general kind of production possibility sets, okay? And those are described here, production possibility sets, by this inequality, okay? So We call this the technology. I'm going to introduce another technology in a minute, but this technology means if this is the amount of labor effort put in by so the curly bracket here means the labor supply of every agent. Tell me what every agent is supplying in labor. Tell me the whole constellation of labor supplied by each person. Given that, we have a production possibility frontier. Given that, we can produce more construction or more software. And tell me what that frontier is like. That's what this inequality is going to give you. When this inequality is equal to 0, it's going to give you that frontier. Okay? And so this is very general. I'm not putting any constraints on this or anything yet. Now, to introduce robots, I'm going to have to introduce a new... I'm going to introduce robots or trade as if it were a separate technology. There's a separate technology, G star. You might think of it as the new technology. So we use this language. This is the old and this is the new technology. That's just the language to differentiate them. So the important thing here is, let me imagine trade, for example. Trade is, I send some goods to the dock, I export them, I get some goods back at the world prices, and that would be, another frontier that I'm enabled by way of trade to transform one good into another. I transform a U.S. good into a Chinese good by exporting exporting a U.S. good if I'm in the U.S. and importing a Chinese good. And that's what this constraint is meant to capture. Okay? Or in the case of robots, it's going to capture that we may produce a capital good, a robot, okay, from other existing goods. Okay? Instead of consumption goods, we may produce an intermediate input capital good like robot. And that would be capturing the way in which we can produce that. Okay? The dichotomy, the only important thing about this, that there's two technologies, I need to introduce a tax. So the whole point is, do I want to distort firms? And for that, I need to introduce, I want to think of a tax being placed between the demanders of robots and the producers of robots. And because I have to think of that wedge, of that tax getting in between two firms, I need to separate the technologies. If I weren't taxing, I could just imagine there's just one technology and I just subsume both of them into one greater meta technology. Okay? But because I'm thinking about the idea of taxing and getting in between them, I have this notation. So that's just to say the dichotomy is really nothing to do with anything except the policy question. If I'm thinking of a tax on robots, that creates the dichotomy, who are the producers of robots and who are the demanders. Okay? That's the way to think about it.
And I guess it doesn't matter that there's no N in the new technology.
Right.
You could always do it through the old one first.
Yes. So I was going to note that. We're going to assume, for simplicity of the presentation, that there's no labor in this new technology. That fits well, first of all, many of our examples. So if you think about trade, that's typically how trade is modeled. You send some things to the dock, you get some back. Okay? And labor is not really part of that equation. And likewise, when we think of producing capital goods, a typical assumption is that they're produced from the final good. Okay, so that would fit the simplest models of capital formation. Okay, but it actually turns out to be without loss of generality. So we've shown this. There's an appendix of the paper. And the idea is very simple. Basically, think of robots. Maybe robots are produced by a particular worker. So then they wouldn't satisfy this, it seems. But imagine I just create another sector that demands those robots, and before they can be used in production, they need to be certified. Okay, so they just go through another firm that's really just like in through one door, out through the other, and all they do is get certified. That's the company I'm taxing. And that would be like this G star. Okay? So that's the intuition for the math that's in this appendix. But basically, it's without loss of generality. Yeah.
I know I'm asking the same question, but it seems important. So if you mentioned machine learning as an example, and that seems like something that's highly complementary with people with high end.
Yeah.
But like you still need some humans, but it's just the high skilled can use and the low skilled can't.
Yeah.
So is that particular type of asymmetry, is that encompassed?
Yes. Let me explain that. Good. That is the same. So basically, that's a complementarity that lives here.
Right.
So if I use machine learning, someone developed a good machine learning algorithm and hardware to go with it, and I buy that stuff in my firm, that's going to help me produce more. That's an input in here. And it may be more complementary with having a certain kind of worker, a certain theta type. Okay, so that's going to be showing up in here. Okay?
But if you wanted to tax that, that would be a labor tax.
No, I would model that as a tax on that particular software of machine learning software or hardware. Okay? Which gets at the issue here, which I don't want to completely avoid, but we're assuming you can tax it. If you can't tax it or you can tax it imperfectly, we'd be in a third, fourth best, and we could study that. So some people have, I completely acknowledge, let's say, taxing robots. Robots is a bit fuzzy thing. So then we would get into an issue of what's a robot, and maybe if we're taxing it, we would, ideally here you would put the tax on the robots that you want to. Maybe in reality, if you start putting a tax on a robot, you accidentally tax things that you don't really want to tax. That's an issue. That's a separate issue. But it's not your question, but I just thought of it. But the point is, here that would be completely captured by that. So in this notation, let me make clear this notation. It's all on one slide, but I spent some time on it, as you see. It's a little bit abstract, but the point is, if you think about it enough, you can see you can fit many examples in here, okay? And the abstract notation also helps kind of not have to write too much, and you can focus on the ideas, I hope. So the basic point, if you want it just memotechnically, is there's some workers, they're supplying labor. The firms are using that labor to produce goods. And we're going to mess with how they're producing goods by taxing this technology interaction with that technology. Okay? All right. Any other questions? Okay, so that's preferences, technology. And then this is the market clearing condition. Good by good, the amount consumed has to be equal to the amount produced by both sectors. Okay? So let me make clear in the notation here, things like, so some of these y's may be negative for one sector. So negative would mean I'm demanding this good. So in the case of robots, for I equal to robot, that y may be positive in this sector. They're producing robots, and they're selling it to this sector, so this one is negative. Okay? Right? And maybe nobody consumes those industrial robots, so this side is 0 in that case. Okay? So that would be one example. All right? Okay, so this is just to make this notation come slightly alive. Now, here's an example in the case of trade. Okay, so in the case of trade, the way I would think about G star is it's just a trade balance condition. It just says that, if I take prices as given, if I'm a small open economy, and we could think about this is just a simple case, small open economy, the case without a small open economy. With a small open economy, you take prices as given. Okay, I parameterize them here by fee, but they're like fixed fee then you take the prices as given, and this would be your trade balance condition. All right? So you can only import to the extent that you've exported. Okay? And of course, if we think of, we could extend this to an intertemporal setting, and that would hold in an intertemporal sense, not period by period. So you could have a trade balance that's not holding period by period. But this would be the trade balance condition in general. So you see, you would have some positive y's would be exports, and the negative y's would be imports. Okay? Okay. What about robots? To take us one application, this is in the spirit of some of the kind of task models that you see around there. So here I'm assuming, so YM would be the machines or robots, and we're going to produce them linearly from the final good. Okay? So it's sort of this roundabout capital technology. And phi would be a parameter of how efficient you are at producing those. So if I increase phi, I'm going to get more productive at making robots. I would think of that as giving me a cheaper robot. Okay? So I want to think of technological progress here as an increase in phi. Yeah. And then final goods are produced from a continuum of intermediate goods with some substitution, a CES. And each one of these goods is produced either from labor or from robots. Okay? And here I think I'm missing an integral. So you can choose any labor to use there. Okay? Except because I made it linear, This model has the feature, so sorry, you see the d theta, it's adjusting an integral, I'm missing the integral there. This is saying I can produce linearly these tasks, I would call these I tasks, either using a worker, and then each worker would have a certain productivity at that task, AI theta. Okay? So that would capture that some workers are particularly good at some tasks and not others. Okay? So this could be, the repetitive tasks versus the more creative tasks. All right? And then, in addition, a robot might produce that, okay, with some productivity. So they might be good at some tasks and not others. Okay? So this is kind of a task model. It's basically a nested CES that emphasizes that at the end you have something more linear looking. So you're going to get a lot of corners here. Basically, you're going to get some workers doing some tasks, some workers not doing some tasks, and the same thing for robots. So you get a kind of sorting because of this linearity. That's the so-called task framework. Okay? Yeah. But more generally, these are just examples. More generally, we could have all sorts of we could have some less than perfect substitutability here. We could have more of a description of input-output production and so on. So this is a very, very general framework in that sense. Yeah.
Do people have any endowments of the Ys? If not, does that matter?
Good. No, there's no endowments of the Y, and it doesn't matter here because I would think of consumption as just the net demand in the market. Okay. So if there's any of that, it would be embedded in the V. Okay. Yeah. But in our applications, sometimes, so one thing we're going to do here is when we think of robots, and this example shows it, we're going to think of a robot as something that's produced. Okay. And just like capital. And you might think an alternative view is, no, a robot is something someone owns and other people don't own. Well, we think, yeah, that's after the fact is true, but before it had to be produced. Okay, so we're not thinking of a situation where it's inelastically endowed and there's some lucky people with them. Okay, we think that comes into play more in a dynamic sense. Like there might be, just like with the capital tax literature, there's an issue of, well, once the investment is made, don't we really want to tax it? So we're think of our framework as really asking a very ex ante thing before that capital is there. Because we want to abstract from that issue since it's similar to the capital tax issues and all the time inconsistency things that have been pointed out about capital. So schematically, this is the model. There's some households. They're sending their labor and they're getting these goods back. They do that facing prices and wages for their labor. So for example, like I said, you might be able to work as a software engineer, or in the construction business, you're going to look at the different wages and do whatever's best. Okay, and then some people might earn more than others because they more easily can provide the high wage labor. And then old technology is receiving this labor, producing the goods, and they're also trading with this new technology. These goods Y. So they might be taking inputs, robots, or take and so on. Okay, and this could be trade as well. In which case, you might think that trade, is trading both with the old firms and directly with households. Okay, so this is the sort of the framework. Here, P would be the same everywhere. Okay, that would be if we're not interfering, if we're not taxing at all. So that would be sort of one benchmark. But of course, we're interested in a case where we're putting in a nonlinear tax here. So the household is also going to be looking at that. And also the prices here, Q, might be different from the prices for producers because we might have consumption taxes. All right, so that's very standard. But the main thing, that's not our focus, the main thing is that we're also going to allow these prices to be different from those prices. So that's going to come about because there's a tax, a wedge between these guys. So in particular, the robot producer is getting $1 for every robot, but the robot demander is having to pay $2 for every robot. That's the main focus. Okay? Yes?
Is everyone a price taker?
Yes, everyone's a price taker.
You don't have a patent on a robot that you can license, and you can have monopoly power.
No, we're abstracting from that. We do believe, we've thought about the usual monopolistic competition layer, it wouldn't change any of our results, but not anything more sophisticated than that. So the usual thing that would give you a constant markup kind of, we think everything would go through there. We have in mind especially the typical trade model that I know my co-author works a lot with. You know, those models, we have a strong sense that everything would go through. We're working in that sense with a neoclassical competitive model. All right. So in general, taxes mean all these prices are different. Actually, for today, I'm going to simplify and focus on this distinction. And I'm going to set the taxes on consumers to be 0. Okay? That's just for simplicity. Okay? Just to simplify the exposition. All right. Because this captures what we want, which is mainly, you know, we would have then a tax on robots, for example, which is an input into this technology. Right? All right. So the household budget constraint, just to put math to that idea, is you spending on these goods. So this is your total spending. You're getting that from your earnings, which is the wage times your labor, and you are getting taxed non-linearly by that on that earning. Okay, how am I doing on time? So that's the labor income tax. The old technology faces these prices P as well, because we're simplifying and assuming there's no consumer taxes. That's not important, and it's paying these wages. And the new technology, from our simplifying assumption that they don't hire labor, we don't have to think about that. And the crucial thing is they're paying these prices or earning these prices P star. Okay, that might be different from P. So that's, again, our focus. And the focus then is on how P relates to P star. That would be an ad valorem tax rate. That's our focus. We want a formula for these tax rates. Okay? So in the background in our paper, we will have a nonlinear income tax. And some of the focus in the literature has been on that nonlinear income tax. Our focus is instead on this tax rate, okay? Right? And the nonlinear income tax is playing an important role, but we're not trying to explore the shape that takes, okay? Instead, we want to think what's left, what job is left for T star, okay? All right? Okay, so that doesn't mean you don't want to look at this. People talk about like basic income, universal basic income. I think of that as a particular shape for capital T. And that's all embedded in here in that we're allowing a flexible nonlinear income tax. Okay? So universal basic income is sort of the intercept of that schedule. Okay. What's the crucial point here? The crucial point is the following. For any given labor supply, basically from the G technology, they are the demanders for labor. They're going to, from profit maximization, you're going to get a demand for labor that depends on wages and prices. Okay? So just micro 101, maximize this subject to the G technology, you're going to get this demand for labor. Okay? And the general point is for any given supply of labor, that means we're going to get some equilibrium. Okay? So we're going to get some equilibrium wage for each wage type. So for the high skill workers and for the low skill workers, we're going to get a wage in equilibrium, taking as given their labor supply. Of course, the labor supply is not exogenous, but thinking once that labor supply is chosen, that will imply some wage. But the important point is to make is that wage is going to depend on prices. Okay? So if prices are higher for a particular good that the high skilled workers produce, then the wage of high skilled workers is typically going to go up. Okay? So in particular, or conversely, if the price of coal goes down, coal miners are going to earn less. Okay? So that's what we're capturing here. Yeah?
Have you guys thought about what would happen if these guys were displaced by robots, they lose their job and you have some unemployment either because your wage can't fall enough or some other things like that?
No, we're not doing that. So this is not really related to the slide, but more generally, our framework does not focus on things like unemployment and things that might be important for a transition. I think I would take our model as, especially the way we apply it, to be more like a steady state situation or a long run situation. Because those other questions I think are interesting, but they open up probably other policy tools that you want to think about. like special assistance or unemployment benefits or training and things like that. We want to think of sort of, more generally a policy once the shock has happened, so to speak, and the dust has settled. Okay. But fair point. We don't have that. But going back to this line of thought, so the main mechanism of the paper, this I think you need to understand, is very, very simple. Why are we going to want to fiddle with P versus P star? Because we want to fiddle with P. And why do we want to fiddle with P? Because we want to affect the wages. And that's the point I'm making here. And why do we want to affect the wages? Because that has a distributional impact. Okay? And it has a distributional impact even though we have a nonlinear tax schedule. So we have another way to affect things distributionally. But intuitively, the nonlinear tax schedule also has a cost, a disincentive cost. So because it's an imperfect tool, if we try and redistribute too much, we lower effort. Because of that, we do want to lean a little bit on making the inequality lower, on making wage dispersion not too high. That's the intuition for everything. So intuition for everything is prices appear in the wages, and because of that, we can use T star to affect inequality, and that's useful in a complementary way to the nonlinear income tax. Okay? All right? Okay, that's key. So now I really have a new way to describe this, but I'm still describing it here the old way. So I'm going to try and do it two ways. So here's way number one to think about this. I'm going to look at an objective function for the government that I'll call W for welfare. And it's a function very generally of the whole utility, the whole population, each person got. Okay? With one restriction only. It only depends on the CDF of that utility. So that's capturing kind of an anonymity. I don't care if Mary or Sam get switched places. Okay? And that's just very general, but it has that. So it's almost Paretian, but for this kind of, I don't care about these switches. Okay? And that's where we get all the mileage and we're able to deal with many dimensions of heterogeneity. Okay? So the only constraint is for anything that's happening in this economy, every one of you is getting some utility. Just tell me the CDF of that utility. And that's what I'm calling U of Z, where Z is the percentile in the distribution. Okay? And that percentile will be the same as the percentile of wages here, because everyone has the same utility over consumption goods. Okay? So it's going to be the same as the percentile of wages. I mean, the ranking Z is going to be the same. Right.
So that's because of the separability.
Yes. That's what that buys us. Mm-hmm. So the key thing here is, and this is the second way to say it. The second way to say it is don't think that there's an objective or a plan or anything. What I'm going to show you next are situations where there's a almost Pareto improvement. I'm going to focus on things that shift the distribution to the right. And I'm going to call those things good. And the nature of my results are going to be that if you're not setting taxes the way I tell you should, I can show you how to do better in that sense. In the sense of shifting the distribution of utilities to the right. A first order dominant change in utilities, so to speak. Okay? If we think of the utilities as a random variable in the distribution in the population, then we're shifting it to the right. And that's sort of a very general setup. I'm not adopting a particular utilitarian welfare function or anything. Okay? But it has this, I would say, very defendable restriction of kind of anonymity, and that's what's allowing us to get mileage without thinking about and having these multiple distributions. In particular, if you only had one dimension of heterogeneity, this would have no bite, basically. It would be whatever, this would give you just a Pareto criterion. Okay? Okay.
There could be losers, right? I mean, people could switch, and so...
Right, that's why. But if it switches, it's because we don't have one dimension. So in the standard case where we just have one dimension, right? Exactly. So my point is, this assumption, if you're used to the one-dimensional case, it's not even an assumption. it's to deal with the second, this more general model that I'm saying we were happy and proud that we managed to do, because, for instance, it captures the Roy model, which is important in labor. And I think it's important for thinking about big changes in the economy and reorganization of across occupations, to think of things like the Roy model. So we have it. And in that case, it has some bite. Okay? But I think it's a defendable assumption. So it's a very...
But it's still, in general, there could be many losers from the policies that you call good.
Yes, absolutely.
So if you think about political economy and so forth, that's good matter.
Well, I'm not going to do that now, but conjecturing quickly, I mean, suppose the CDF didn't change. Then there's got to be as many winners as losers, right? Because they didn't change. So if I shift it to the right, I think I can prove there's going to be more. So at least with majority voting, you know, but I haven't done that analysis. But this is kind of getting back to your early question. And I think it's one part, this is more for the public finance crowd, where we have innovated the way to write this down. Okay. This is the government, if you want to think of the objective. I don't have to show you the budget constraint of the government for the usual reasons. It's going to be implied by the equilibrium conditions. The planning problem I'm studying is find the best tax system and equilibrium for this economy. Find the best combination of prices and taxes that maximizes that welfare function. Now, in the alternative interpretation, we won't have a welfare function. I'm just going to show you taxes that cannot be improved upon in the sense of shifting things to the right. Okay? Right? Okay. Is that clear? So let me show you the first result here. This is a very simple result, so it's going to take me 2 slides. But basically, this is the first question. When are we happy if technology improves? And here, you remember I slipped in this phi, so think of this as a change in phi. So the G-star technology might be indexed by phi. And robots get cheaper to produce, for example, or trade with China gets cheaper and easier. When are we happy that that happens? So let me think of indexing W, the welfare obtained by phi then. And so this is a comparative static question on phi with respect to that welfare. And the main result here is very simple. Well, the welfare is going to improve if and only if that change in technology is positive in the sense of an expansion in the technological frontier locally. Okay? And the basic idea here, so stepping back, this is a little bit surprising because we're not in a first best world where that would be obvious. We have second best instruments and we care about distribution. So a change in phi might improve technology, but it might really have a very bad effect on inequality. Okay? So the reason we are getting this result is we have, although tools are restricted, we just have just enough tools always so that if we wanted, we could nullify those effects. Okay? So point in case, in the case of trade, we could always put tariffs high enough that we get the same amount of trade as we had before China became so open. That doesn't mean that's going to be optimal. But that's the logic behind this result. Because you could always do that, you can't be worse off if China is not willing to send you goods at a cheaper price. Okay? All right? And so the logic, once you see it, is very simple. But, okay, it's just telling you that with this instrument, then you have enough for this result. And I don't know, I think it's a powerful, very simple result, basically. So obviously, if you don't use that tool or you don't have it, this result wouldn't be true. Okay? And those are the papers I cited earlier by Spector and so on. Okay? So the point here is if you do have that tool, then you should always be happy for that. And the reason is straightforward once you see it. But I think the nice thing here, at least coming into the question, I hadn't seen it. Yes? Sorry, there's a question way in the back first. Yes? Yes, exactly. So this would be saying, let me say it for the case of robots, if robots get cheaper, okay, that would be one way to think of technological progress, then we could always make the robots as expensive for firms that would be substituting them for workers as they were originally. Okay, and we can't be worse off then because the wages will be the same as before. And yet we're wasting less resources in the G-star technology. We don't have to use as much inputs to produce those robots, so we're still better off. Okay? Or in the case of trade, well, we're sending less goods to China and getting the same amount of goods back as before, so we're better off. Okay? So it's a very, very simple result. Once you see it, we didn't think it was obvious, and we find it kind of interesting. So there's no, one other way to say it is there's no immiserizing growth. Okay? You are always better off if there's a growth.
Just to be sure, so you have to be able to adjust these instruments.
Yes, yes.
If you keep taxes the same,
Of course.
then
Of course, yeah. The game we're playing here is you can adjust these instruments. We're taking the Bill Gates lead, we're taking the Trump lead of saying we have tariffs, we have, if they're not on the table, it's a different analysis. I think they're kind of on the table nowadays, or there'll be more on the table. We've become disinhibited. This is what it is.
We discussed political economy reasons before, so if you might not be able to adjust robot taxes as much as you would want it to,
Yeah.
there could be doing this.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say political economy necessarily restricts instruments. It might just affect how you use them. That might be embedded in this welfare function in particular, but in some cases. But the point generally is, yeah, you do need this instrument. Okay.
And in the background, you're also adjusting potentially the labor tax, right?
Yeah.
That's also going on.
Yes, that's always going on. And I'm not talking about it, but it's always going, it's important. In general, you would need it, okay? Let me say one more thing here. This is not going to happen. So it's not true that you want to adjust them in that direction to keep the price of Chinese goods the same as before, or the price of robots. This is like an envelope theorem, which is always very intuitive, but then you don't want to mistakenly imagine that means you don't change things, okay? When fee changes, you actually will maybe let Chinese goods be cheaper or robots be cheaper. It's just you had the option not to, and because of that, this result for welfare holds, okay? Yeah, there was a question, sorry.
Where does strict inequality come from? I mean, your argument about nullifying just tells me that we cannot be worse. So why not restrict?
Right, but you saved resources there. As long as you save some resources, there's always a way that you can get those resources and be better off. That's the basic idea. Was there another question?
So that thing is because G star is a high dimensional object.
No. G star has high dimensional arguments, but it's just a number. So G star less than or equal to 0, so it's a real valued function. I think there was another question. No? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so in the trade context, I have this slide mainly because of my co-author was a trade economist. But spelling it out in the case of trade, it just says you're always better off if the terms of trade improved favorably. So if at the current export and imports that you're doing, prices became cheaper for your imports, more expensive for your exports, you're better off. Okay. So that would mean probably in the China shock case, you're better off because it's been a improvement in terms of trade for the U.S. Okay. All right. And these kind of results we've checked are robust. We talked about this earlier. And for these particular results, we have already checked that they're robust to imperfect competition and a bunch of other market imperfections. Okay, because the logic of this result is very simple. Whatever you were doing, you could always keep the prices the same. So even if the market is very imperfect for other reasons, you're not going to change the equilibrium there. Okay, so that would hold. Let me give you one small application of this. It's kind of the simplest form to think about innovation. It's not the best way, okay? I'm not trying to, but we think it suggests that something that would be robust. But the simplest way to think about innovation, imagine, is that firms are choosing the technology fee from a set. So fee was a set, there was a set of feasible fees, and then we're choosing the value of fee that we want, okay? And innovation is that choice of fee, okay? And then this would say the government does not want to restrict you to a smaller set. In that sense, we don't want to disincentivize the choices and make you choose something you didn't want to choose, okay? More generally, if you had some costly way of innovating, we conjecture you would get that you do not want to subsidize nor tax innovation for the motives presented here, okay? So what does this mean? I think this means So basically, when you speak of innovation and you now set it in a endogenous growth model, there are in general reasons why innovation may not be optimal, okay, in equilibrium. Let's say think of a Romer endogenous growth model. There are externalities. Knowledge is something that's non-rival, etc. So there are actually countervailing forces, and the equilibrium may be, depending on how you set patterns and so on, efficient or not, okay? So we think if you extended the model to have those kind of features, all we're saying is those models typically ignore distributional issues. What we're saying is the distributional issues are not adding any new layer to that, okay? So that's our conjecture for how this result would generalize, okay, in a sort of endogenous growth model where maybe you have imperfect competition and so on. So intuitively, what we think it would be adding is generally there are two forces that people talk about. The stealing business effect means people innovate too much. The fact that it's non-rival means they innovate too little, or the love of variety. And those two compete, and we're saying that there's no new third one, okay? And in that sense, these concerns do not add a reason to mess around with innovation, okay? So we think that's interesting because I mentioned earlier in the introduction, I don't know, the NSF or in Europe, the analogous institutions, they do make decisions on who they're subsidizing innovation or basic science that will either lead to more innovations in certain fields. Should we subsidize then robots or not? Or should we remain kind of neutral? Our result is suggesting, or should we remove or even tax the innovation of robots or subsidize other fields of innovation relative to robots? And this is saying, no, keep it level, I think, okay? All right, there's no special reason to change the tax or subsidy on innovations that lead to robots. Yes? Yes, sorry, yes, I understand your question now. Yes, so so what's going on here? Why is this result holding? You've asked me a question that leads to that question. I think that's the answer is we do not want to tax. Why is it that we're not taxing innovation here? Or why is there no new reason to tax or subsidize innovation? The key thing is we are already targeting directly the product. So we will have a tax on robots once they're created or once they're improved. We don't need to have a tax at the innovation stage, okay? Basically, it's kind of a targeting principle. You've already taken care of your concern through the other tax, and there's nothing left over for the innovation stage, okay? So again, this is crucial that you have the other instrument, which I've said from the introduction, I'm going to study this instrument, tax on robots or tariffs. We have those instruments. If you don't have them, maybe as a fourth best, you want to affect innovation. All right? Yeah. Yes.
Would this no subsidy conclusion change if this technology has some first mover advantage, winner take all dynamic where you want to say, okay, we are China, we want to be the leader in this industry. If we wait, US comes first, so we're going to subsidize.
Okay. I think yes, it would change for those reasons and many other reasons. People have said in general, innovations is a setting where we don't think of the first welfare theorems. Okay, so what we're trying to say is there's no new reason on top of those. But those reasons you could have without thinking of distribution, without thinking of the concern for inequality within the United States. What we're saying is that is not adding in our model any additional one. Yeah.
So everything that you said, it doesn't seem like changing the linear tax schedule plays that much of a role. So are there cases where you can actually make it not change at all? You might not get the part of improvement.
Yeah. For these results, I agree. As I said, answered a question, I realized you might not even need to change the tax schedule. I think to get the weak inequality, you don't need to change it, but to get the strict one, you need to give resources back, so you might have to change it. But you're right that
the the good is falling from China, just one for one offset that with an increase in the tariff.
Right. But now how do I make everyone better off? There's more resources in the economy, so I think you've got the revenue from the tariff, and you want to give it back to people. So I think I can give you a simple example. In the quasi-linear utility case people work with, you would want to change the tax schedule by a constant, right, to give that revenue back. Okay? So it has a very minimal role, I would say. I agree with you. So now it's going to have a bigger role in the next stuff. Okay, so let me switch gears to answer. This is really where the main results lie, so I don't want to be short of time for that, but I think we're perfectly on time. So the question is, how should government policy respond? And it's not really respond here. So now I'm not going to be changing fee and asking how. I'm just going to ask what tax policy should look like for any given fee. Of course, that's going to give you how you should respond if you do a comparative static. But we're not going to focus on the comparative static. Okay, so again, remember, this is just kind of from the introduction. If we had taxes that were lump sum, we would get the first best. Ignore that. If we had the Diamond-Merlis, it would be a tax schedule like this, linear, but the tax rate depends on theta. We don't think that's realistic. Okay? We're in this world where we have the nonlinear income tax on earnings. Okay? But the wages are endogenous. And I said that's the crucial point. So I'm trying to remind you just what the crucial ingredients are. Okay? So now what I'm going to do is look at optimality conditions and derive a formula for the optimal tax. And that has to do with effectively taking a first order condition with respect to this price and seeing how it improves the objective. Or, which is the same, because first order conditions are the same, performing a variation and checking what happens with the objective. Okay? And I'm going to prefer discussing it as a variation today. Okay? But it turns out there's really going to be three formulas. Okay? And that's because it'll depend on there are many variations you can perform. There's going to be a lot of first order conditions, in other words. And then I'm going to argue which ones I find more useful. Okay? So I'm going to go a little bit, you'll see they're all kind of related. And in fact, I'll show you the mother of all formulas first. Okay? This meta formula is basically a general variation. And then I'll specialize it to these three cases. The first, we don't change the tax schedule. Okay? In the second, we change the tax schedule, but we make sure people don't change their labor supply. Okay? And in the third, we change the tax schedule, we allow the labor supply to change, but we make sure people don't change their utility. Okay? And those three variations each have a different formula that you get. They're all useful. They all involve the tax formula, but we're going to find this one to be the most useful. Okay? For reasons you'll see immediately why. But okay, and this relates to work I've done and others have done that, sort of, in some cases, a Pareto analysis. This is close to being a Pareto analysis. This is going to allow us to drop out. It's not going to matter how we evaluate different people. Okay? All right, so a general variation would be we change the tax on robots or the tariffs, and we change the nonlinear income tax, and that produces a change in producer prices, a change in wages, a change in production, a change in labor, and a change in consumption. Okay? And then that satisfies a new equilibrium. And what we're saying here, this is just a simple formula that says, if this equation doesn't hold, you would be able to improve welfare by such a variation. So if you engineer a variation with these deltas, delta means this is how much this tax has changed, and you plug it into this formula, then you will be able to improve welfare unless this formula holds. So a necessary condition for not being able to improve welfare is that this condition holds. Okay? And this condition...
So lambda bar is the average welfare rate?
Yeah, I was going to spell it out now. So let me go here. So the basic thing about this formula, that I already played one trick on you. Instead of theta, I'm integrating against z. Z is like the percentile. So like there's a little mini result here already, which is you can just tell me what things look like projected onto one dimension of heterogeneity. The one that's empirically people look at, which is the percentiles. So you don't need to think of the Roy model and identify theta and everything. That would be very complicated. We know it's not even identified. We can look at the percentile distribution, which is how empirical work is usually carried out. We think that's kind of neat. But then each of these terms has a lot of intuition. I'm going to walk you through it. The first here, just to say what lambda is what Florian was mentioning. It's a welfare weight. Okay? So really the way to state this is there exist positive values for lambda for which this holds. Okay? And why is this welfare weight coming into play? There are three terms here. Let me describe them. The first is the direct effect of the change in the wage. So if the wage changes, then you're going to keep this extra earnings, where tau is the marginal tax rate on income. So an individual at percentile Z will earn this much more if the wages change in this direction. So in particular, if a high-skilled wage goes up, they're going to earn this much more. If the wage skill goes down, they're going to earn that much less. And intuitively, we're going to weigh those depending on the welfare weights. Okay? The other term here, though, is something we heard about in the last talk, which is we also need to adjust by prices. The rich people consume different goods in general. I haven't assumed homotheticity or anything. So the rich might consume goods that go up in price less based on this variation. So this is kind of a percentile-specific inflation rate. And people look at that empirically, in development, for instance, and so on. My colleague, David Atkin, has a paper on this. So people go out and look at this. And intuitively, it's saying, this is like your measure of real income. How much did your income go up? Oh, kind of subtract the fact that I consume a different basket than you. Okay? So that term comes into play. The other term is the mechanical one, which is if you raise my taxes, I'm worse off. If you lower my taxes, I'm better off. And all that is intermediated by these welfare weights. Okay? Which basically add up to zero, but here in but since this parenthesis is not generally constant, this right-hand side is not going to be zero. Okay? What about the terms on the left? The terms on the left are what people call fiscal externalities. Basically, if we produce more Y star, and there's a wedge between P star and P, that goes to the government, a third party or fourth party, that no one's taking into account. Okay? So that's extra revenue that the two parties to that transaction weren't taking into account. That's an externality. So intuitively, it comes into play. Or more usually, that's what the Harvard triangle is all about. And then, so you have that, and then you have an analogous one for the nonlinear income tax. If labor changes at different points of the percentile distribution, we're going to get this change in revenue according to the marginal taxes there. So if the marginal taxes are all zero, which would be, just as an example, but it's not realistic, we wouldn't have this term. But because the marginal tax rate, nonlinear tax rate, in general has a positive marginal tax rate, we'll typically have this term. Okay, so that's the mother of all formulas I mentioned. So let me walk very quickly through two and then focus on the third one. So the first one is do this kind of general variation, but set delta cap t to 0. So set this thing to 0. And we're going to kill that term. And then working on the other terms a little bit, because, for example, how much did the labor change is connected to how much the wage changed. So we work that out more, okay? And we think we're the first paper to really do that in this context. So we work that out more, and by plugging in, then we get this formula here, which is slightly simplified relative to the other one. The other trick we perform, which we perform in all formulas, so I'll mention it now, is we divide by this. So we get directly a formula for the difference between the P and P star. So we get directly a formula for the tax. So let me show you what I mean. So we get P versus P star. So that would be the tax on robots equals this right-hand side. And now the right-hand side has the effect at different points of the percentile distribution of having more robots. I'm going to read it for you like that. So that's like a derivative of the wage at every percentile as a function of having more robots in the economy. Okay, and this is getting closer to those quantile regressions I was mentioning. Okay, we start to see those kind of effects there. Okay, but we still have this price inflation adjustment that we need to perform. Okay, so there's still a role for looking at people's basket and seeing whose prices went up more. And then we have this fiscal externality from the labor income tax that I threw to the right side, but now I've solved for the change in n, so it's also written out in terms of the quantile regression for wages. So what's the neat thing I just want to mention here, already you're seeing a role for this wage, knowing how the wage changes with respect to having more of this particular y, having more robots, say, for example. Okay? So what we've done here is we had all those terms, we killed this one, and we just developed these other ones a little more. Yeah, you had a question? No. Okay. All right. But this isn't, one reason we don't like this so much is, first of all, this is hard work. I know some people do this, and that's great. This is also philosophically difficult for us. Like, we don't know what the right welfare weights are. So how would we implement this formula, okay, if we don't know what the right welfare weights are? So hold on, we're going to see that we can get rid of that. So the other formula is don't change n. And that also simplifies. If you go to the mother of all formulas, you're going to drop this term out, okay? And after developing it a little bit, we get this formula, which we also like, which also again emphasizes what's happening with the wage distribution. So it's the total derivative of this omega. Omega is not the wage. What it is, omega is the rate of change of the wage between one percentile and the other. So it's a measure of inequality. So one nice thing you see here is already you see that if wage inequality doesn't go up, so if everyone's wage goes up by a constant, for instance, then this whole right-hand side would be 0, and we should have no tax on robots. Okay? So that's one thing we like about this formula. But again, so it's gotten a little simpler, but again, like, you know, this might be observable from regressions. This is observable. Again, this is a function of the welfare weights. Okay, so it's like the welfare lambda I had, but it's a formula in terms of the lambda. So again, I don't know what that is. Yes. Okay, so it's gotten nicer. And you might say, well, where is the tax? The tax is changing. What we've done here, again, is do the work of writing the tax change that was needed so that n stayed constant. So it's embedded in here already. Okay? All right. A curious thing, this is kind of just a side note, but it's kind of curious. The inflation already went away. So we don't need to know the different inflation. Okay? That's the different consumers are experiencing. Right? And that we found kind of interesting. I'm not really going to dwell on that, but the formula we like the most is obtained by a variation that ensures that utility stays constant. And you wouldn't know that looking at the mother of all formulas because there was no role for going back to the mother of all formulas. But it's through the work, because the way when utility is held constant, there's a connection between this term and that term, for example. Okay? And so a lot of other things drop out. Okay? Intuitively, this was the change in utility of an agent at percentile z. And if I hold utility constant, this whole parenthesis then is 0. Okay? So I'm going to kill the right term. And I'm only going to be left with the two left terms. Okay? So that's what this formula is. Also developing it so that the change in labor is already expressed in terms of the way the wage distribution changes. Okay? So what we see here is a formula that says the tax on robots depends on how the wage distribution is changing, whether inequality is going up or not, because of having more robots. And then other terms that intermediate that, in particular the tax rate. So if the tax rate is 0, then there's no motive for taxing robots because there's no fiscal externality. Okay? And also the elasticity, this is the elasticity of labor supply at that percentile. That matters because that's also going to, if there's no reaction of labor, there's going to be no fiscal externality. Okay, so if epsilon were 0, there would be no effect. Okay, so the way to read this is, it's capturing that fiscal externality term, and it has intuitively elements that we're used to seeing, like tax rates, the elasticity of labor, and one new element which we think is nice because people had already in reduced form doing this, which is how that wage schedule is changing with the introduction of robots. Okay? And again, I emphasize, but we didn't assume a particular CES, this or that, or task model. This is very general, of course, at the cost that now I really need to get at this empirical object. Okay? But I think it's always better to proceed this way. Because otherwise, I mean, this is another way to see it, is this contribution is to understand what we really need. What we really need is knowledge about these objects. Okay? And maybe we go down a different route and we write a structural model, but then be mindful that what is mattering about that structural model and what you have to get right is the impact on these wages and not other details. Okay? So there's another way to read this. But I prefer going directly from this then to the empirical evidence because I think anything else where we slap on some assumptions is going to inadvertently make things up on the right-hand side. We may as well, when we implement this, we're going to have a lot of uncertainty about these numbers, but we may as well kind of be upfront about it. Okay, so that's the contribution here. So basically, this variation kills all these effects, and we're left only with the fiscal externality effects. So the great benefit here is we no longer have those welfare weights. So we don't need to know how we value one percentile versus the other, which is a tricky issue. We directly can look at this formula. Okay. Just 1 second. Let me hold off the question 1 second. So this is where some people get confused. So how can that be? Because, I mean, are you assuming things are optimal? That's why? Okay. And the answer is no. More precisely, what I'm claiming is if this condition doesn't hold, I don't know if you were optimizing or not. Presumably, I can tell you you're not, because I'm going to be able to give you a variation that produces a rightward shift in utilities. Thus, all of the good tax policies, the ones that I can't find something that rightward shifts utilities, have the property of satisfying this condition. Okay? But I don't know if they're optimal. I don't know if there is a welfare function or anything. I don't believe necessarily in welfare functions. They're like, something, in the ivory tower we have them, but I don't think in the real world we have them. But so it's said in a way that I think I like best is, this is telling you, if this condition isn't met, you have a very good policy proposal. Okay? Yes? Can you speak up? I'm not sure here. If you have what? Right. No, only initially it would be 0. Then when you do this reform, you introduce taxes. Okay? So the first variation kept taxes constant. So if they were 0, they would stay 0. But in this other variation, I'm keeping utility constant. You're right. Even starting with 0 taxes, that variation requires that I change the nonlinear income tax schedule. Okay.
But I can think of the sort of the social welfare weights are sort of embedded here in the towns, right? In a way.
That's one way to think about it, but I think a restrictive way to think about it. So that helps some people. Okay, how was I able to get away with not looking at the welfare weights? Oh, intuitively, because I read them off the nonlinear income tax. I claim that does it for you, fine. But I think there's a more general way to think about it that's, I think, better, which is simply, I didn't change utilities. So I didn't need to know how I evaluate different people. Okay? And then I have more resources, so I'll be able to shift things to the right. Okay, this is just a summary. We have all these formulas. The main thing to get out, common to all the formulas, we need the impact on wages. Okay? And I think that's where I promised you, we're going to try and create a bridge between the theoretical work and the empirical work. People are running quantile regressions. We're telling you why you can use them. Okay? And then we provide all 3 formulas, but, our favorite is this one. For completeness, we give you all of them. But they all have this wage impact that's very important. Okay? All right. So let me now apply this the best we can with the available evidence. This is tentative. The available evidence is really good work, but it's very in its infancy probably. Okay? So, so I'm going to take the reduced form evidence as inputs. So I'm going to take the last formula, and I'm just completing elasticities and so on here. The crucial thing I'm just doing for you is, remember this omega is not W, it's the rate of change. So the elasticity of this omega, how to relate it to the change in the wage schedule, which is what people estimate, you need this formula. Okay? So I get the quantile regressions, I come here, and what it's saying is I need to look at the slope of those regressions. I don't care about the levels. Okay? All right. Because basically inequality is going up if at 1 percentile, in log terms, the wage went up more than at the other percentile. So places where it's flat, even whether it's 0 or not, it doesn't matter. It's not changing this number. Okay? It's not changing omega. And then, where am I going to get these numbers? Well, standard places in the literature. There's some leeway to push these numbers higher or lower, depending how you interpret tax rates, statutory or effective tax rates. There's arguments about, the elasticity is here. I think we could push these numbers a little higher, as you see, because we're using kind of relatively low elasticities. relatively low tax rates for today. But I'll give you a range, actually. And the important thing is we're going to get these from the kind of quantile regressions I flashed at you in the introduction. So flashing it again, this is the effect of robots as estimated by Acemoglu Restrepo. And these are the different percentiles and the impact of the wage at that percentile. Okay? And what I care about is the slope here. So this is signaling that robots increase inequality because it's having a very big negative effect at the lower percentile than at the top percentile. In fact, it's having a slightly positive effect at the top percentile. Okay? So after putting in these numbers, we get a tax rate on robots that falls very short of Bill Gates' idea. So we get a tax rate. So this is science, right? So we put this in. We didn't know what we would get. I don't know. We thought we should get 0. That's how we started. We're going to write a paper that says, you guys are wrong. We shouldn't meddle with this. Then we realized, no. In general, we probably want to meddle. Let's figure out how much. And, and then actually, we made a mistake when we inputted these numbers. I have Uwe here to thank for the correction on that. But we put in the numbers of a Acemoglu Restrepo multiplied by 100. Because they passed us a spreadsheet. They didn't tell us. They had multiplied it by 100 to write it in percentages instead of in log differences. And when we inputted it, we got a big number. So we were saying, hey, we're getting what Bill Gates said. I say this just to emphasize how, I guess this is a scientific approach. You come at it, we didn't have, so our first version, we were saying, yeah, we're getting a big number here. We're following the logic of the model, putting the best evidence, and we were getting roughly a tax rate that was, 100%. That means I was doubling the price of robots, which is effectively like taking away half their income, which is what Bill Gates was saying. So we were like, can't be. Bill Gates is so smart. But then when we corrected that, we got very small numbers. Okay? And we're living with those numbers for now. I think there's a range depending on the numbers you put for these tax rates or elasticities. But it seems hard to push it up a lot higher than the one-digit range. Okay? All right. And I'm getting out of time, so I'm going to speed up. Show you quickly the analog for trade. There's this quantile regression run by these authors here, based on the same data as Otter, Dorn, Hansen. And when we input that, we get a tax that's even smaller. So the tariff taxes, they just come out to be very small based on this evidence. Okay? So what could this be due to? Well, it seems that there's a non-negligible effect on the wage distribution, but it's not that big that once you take into account you do have another instrument and what the elasticities are, this is what we're getting. Okay, I don't have time now to try and explain. We're trying to understand better why we're getting these smaller numbers, but it's the main point to say is we haven't stacked the cards in any way. The theory might give you a very big number. Okay, and if we had inputted, we could have gotten, but we're getting these relatively small numbers. Which, by the way, I think are broadly consistent in the case of robots to those more structural models that people had written down. Okay, I'm going to skip this and conclude. I think I'm out of time. So to summarize, the answer to these two questions is, when is technological welcome? Very simple result, but I think interesting that it's always welcome, just like in the first best. And then for what government policy should look like, we give you some formulas that highlight what's important as sufficient statistic, shares and elasticities, and these kind of quantile regressions people are running. And then we have this comparative static I skipped over, so just to advertise it. Let me finish on a funny note. One thing is in this title is trade and robots. But maybe we're not doing, we put a comma really, but we're not doing justice if you thought we were going to interact the two. These two applications that fit our general framework. But one interesting idea, and maybe to think about, is whether they interact. And this cartoon here captures that. So we thought this was kind of cute. If you go for the trade deals, if you go for protection, maybe that helps robots instead of your workers. So maybe you have to think of the problem jointly. But that's a tease because we haven't done that yet. The one we are thinking a lot about is immigration and natural resources and maybe other forms of capital. Thank you.